Welcome to the second of this year's Marshall Lectures. A reminder of the format today. Professor Diamond will present, probably taking again a similar amount of time, taking us up around 6 o'clock. And then there's an opportunity for a question and answer session which will run for about half an hour. So, thank you very much, Professor Diamond. We're looking forward to your second talk. Thank you.
I take it that this is not the usual academic setting where I get to ask you questions and evaluate the answers. Today my focus is on actions before a crisis, the debate that's going on over how to change regulation of financial institutions with an eye on preventing a comeback. Some of the commentators about it are focused on what caused this crisis and saying, oh, you shouldn't mess with that, it had nothing to do with this. But of course, that kind of narrow focus doesn't make sense given, and repeat, this is not the only repeat from yesterday, but there must be somebody here who wasn't here yesterday. The crises come in a variety of forms. And it really is silly to focus on one particular one when doing the kind of overhaul that countries are in the midst of, and through BIS the world is in the midst of. And it's so difficult to do. As the saying goes, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And the ability of the financial institutions to fight back against regulatory change, which is certainly very actively ongoing in the U.S., is clearly a lot more limited while people remember the crisis than will be the case later on. So let's take a look at what's in process of change. So the old role for the central bank generally, not just bank regulation, was monetary policy with a focus clearly in the legislation in the U.S. to pay attention to both inflation and unemployment. There are a number of central banks whose charge is pay attention to inflation and nothing else. I have two comments on that. One, that's a bad idea. The idea that the institution that has a great deal of power to respond to unemployment issues shouldn't do it when the political process has so much difficulty responding otherwise, seems to me tying one hand behind your back for no good reason. But it's not nearly as much of an issue as you might think, because my sense in a number of central banks with a charge like that is they were very much focused on trying to address unemployment issues anyway. So the fortunate case where the reality and the legal structure were different. Sometimes it's an unfortunate case, sometimes it's a fortunate case. But I think it's good to recognize that the extent to which one gets actions like that depend on the particular personnel. I don't know if the change from Trichet to Mario Draghi is behind the interest rate change we've just seen, given that we saw interest rate increases at a time when, at least on my side of the Atlantic, everyone was scratching their heads and wondering what on earth was being thought. So monetary policy is obviously still there as part of the remit for central banks. And the one change there is around bubbles. And the point here is really to contrast Greenspan, contrast early remarks of Bernanke that were pretty much in the same line, and what Bernanke has turned around and said. What Greenspan said, witnessing several bubbles, is first of all, you can never be sure there's a bubble. There's very little in economics you can be really sure of. That seemed to be not a reason not to do something if you thought there was something good to do and you merely had a high probability there was a bubble. And secondly, the right way to deal with bubbles is to let them burst and then make sure you put in enough liquidity so they don't turn out to be a problem. And third, it'd be particularly inappropriate to use monetary policy, interest rate policy, to address a part of the economy connected with a bubble. The element that I agree with is that it would be far better, to the extent you can, to use other tools like loan-to-value ratios to discourage the process that leads to bubbles. And interest rate policy is not as well-targeted a tool as the regulatory structures for, in this case, the housing market. Of course, Greenspan ignored the housing market as well, despite repeated calls to him from various groups that were involved in the housing market calling for changes, pointing out difficulties with lending. The debate went on, particularly between Taylor and Bernanke, of the extent to which the low interest rates of the Fed caused the bubbles. Bernanke spoke at the AEA meetings a couple of years ago, bringing in a scatter diagram of countries that had bubbles and didn't have bubbles, or measuring the extent of rise of house prices. And secondly, looking at the interest rates and showing there was a very disparate pattern. I think, though, while that speaks to causing the bubble, because bubbles, I think, have to have certain initiating events that get them rolling, and then something happens. Whether interest rate policy has an effect on the size of a bubble is something that would be very hard to back out of the other factors that are involved and reach a conclusion on. It strikes me as not implausible that there's a connection between the speed and rise of a bubble and interest rate policy, but, you know, within the normal range. But I don't know that we have any evidence. And I think the critical thing we learned from Reinhart and Rogoff relative to bubbles is bubbles in different assets affect the economy very differently. So stock market bubble goes up, comes down. Yes, there were a margin financing of it, and so there is some debt that gets repudiated and some debt overhangs, but it's concentrated on the well-off part of the profession. It's concentrated in a place that has a lot of flexibility and liquidity. A housing bubble is a different animal. It spreads through a large fraction of the population. It involves things that are then tied together in that the difficulty of people moving is connected in part to the difficulty in the housing market. The financial losses are spread very widely and so affect the ability to do things like finance, start-up businesses. It's a different animal from a stock market animal, and on the bank side it's a different animal, because insofar as there are assets on a bank portfolio that are related to things that you can mark to market, the banks have to come up rather rapidly recognizing what's going on, and often do so, particularly if it's not spread throughout the banking system the way housing assets were out of both the direct lending and the securitization that came with it. On the other hand, when you have assets that are hard to value, like loans that are underwater but are still in payment, should the bank be marking down the value and so recognizing a need for more capital? Hard for an outsider to tell, gives banks the kind of freedom to move that may be unfortunate. Same thing obviously goes for securitization, where particularly after you've had tranching and complex institutions, complex assets, very hard to judge how to price them properly, hard to measure what's going on. So here's a a quote from Reuters, quoting Bernanke. And as you can see, he's opened up the possibility that looking at asset prices might be relevant for interest rate policy. It is tiny opening, but I think that's appropriate given my suspicion that there's quite a bit of research going on, trying to figure out, both at the micro level, how responsive would a housing bubble be to this kind of small changes that are probably the most you would want to do in interest rate policy, given the needs of the rest of the economy. And secondly, can we learn more about what has happened in the past? So that's the bubble story. I want to skip down on this story and talk about consumer protection. Consumer protection has been part of the charge to the Fed and to other regulators for a long time. Indeed, with the SEC and the stock market, protection is a central part of making the market safer for inexperienced participants. The approach taken by the Fed, and I think by and large by other regulators, was a very legalistic approach to the system. That is, a bank would come in with a lengthy contract that was to cover a financial relationship around some new asset or some loan, and the lawyers would look at it and see if it's accurate. Does it, in fact, comply with the law? Is it describing what will happen in an accurate form, accurate in the sense that a lawyer can figure it out and see that it's right? What has happened, in part from the wide coverage of the abuses in mortgage origination and the widespread confusion around a lot of the mortgage-backed assets, they obviously confused not just the individuals, but institutions, including some of the big banks that went down that were holding them on their own book. And there's now much more of a behavioral focus that we're even holding group sessions, focus sessions, to see how things work, to see to what extent there can be pressure to do the consumer protection around the form of having contracts that people actually understand. It's always struck me, and I have no idea what the law is, it's so common when you go to a website to have to agree to something which you'd have to click on something to read many pages before you could go to the website. And presumably that's there because some lawyer thinks it will protect some firm from a lawsuit based on that information. It seems to me that, since I suspect empirically it's hard to imagine people actually reading those contracts extend up to 1% of the population, that it should be viewed as legally null and void that they go to the trouble of having that. That, of course, would not stop them from having it, because it's common in property leases in the U.S. to have clauses in the lease that are in fact not enforceable. Yet, who knows whether the renter will read the contract and think it's something he has to live with, even though it's not enforceable. So the interaction between legal structure and actual behavior around contracts, both in the design, in the response to them, and the eventual legal determinations in the very rare cases where that happens, is a very interesting area. In the U.S., the consumer financial protection as a central issue is very much the creation of Elizabeth Warren, who is now running for Senate in Massachusetts, running for Senate because, as it suggests, the Republicans blocked any chance of her being nominated. Let me tell you a little bit about her. It's an interesting story. She is a Harvard Law School professor who has done a lot of work, both basic legal writing, a legal textbook, and popular writings about bankruptcy. The U.S. went through a bankruptcy reform in the 90s, driven heavily by the credit card companies, in making the argument that people were abusing credit card debt rules, and that this would then raise the cost of credit card use and credit card borrowing to other people. And so by cracking down on the abusers, this would help everybody else who wasn't an abuser. That, anyway, was the theory put forward by the credit card companies. And she did serious empirical work trying to lay out the causal factors around bankruptcies. To a large extent, they're driven by medical bills, by problems around divorce, problems around unemployment. And the sense here of the design of bankruptcy rules in a way that does what they're supposed to do, which is create a fresh start for people who have gotten into trouble without creating too much of a moral hazard problem. So there's a trade-off there, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. Then she wrote a magazine article drawing in part on some of these bankruptcy stories where people were obviously taken advantage of in their loan contracts, arguing for a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. There was strong opposition to the creation of it by the Republicans, but it got into the Dodd-Frank bill. It got in a very interesting way as being located within the Fed, financed through the Fed, but with the Fed having no power over it. And what turned into the political fight was the question, would a bureau like this be so narrowly focused on protecting consumers that they would affect the profitability of banking in a way that would be bad for the industry? So some override rules got written in by consortium of the regulators of banks. She was the obvious candidate to be named to be the first director of it, and it would have been good to have a director quickly to get the process of creating a new institution going. But the Republicans made it clear they would never confirm her. So she was appointed to a position in the Treasury and given the job of organizing the Bureau until it got a director. So they sidestepped the political process, but that meant that when this job was done, she could return to Harvard and consider other options. One of the things that is part of the independence of the Fed and part of the property of central banks generally is they make a lot of money. They issue zero interest debt and they hold money, and they hold positive interest debt and they make a lot of money. And every year the Fed gives its profit to the Treasury to reduce the deficit. That means Congress is not voting on the Fed's budget on a year-by-year basis. And that lowers the extent to which Congress can pressure the central bank to do the kinds of things that the particular congressman would like to see happen. So the idea of locating this bureau based on the Fed doing the financing by rules set in the initial legislation took some political power away from Congress and created more independence. But since the Fed had done a rotten job of consumer protection for years, the idea of there having no say whatsoever in how this bureau, that was in terms of an organizational chart part of the Fed operated, was a natural thing to do, and there is no connection. It's very amusing organizational solution to a couple of political problems. So that's another change. It's a change I consider to the better, and I think another sign of the reach that behavioral economics is starting to have on a variety of policy questions. Let's go back then to the main topic for today's talk, which is what used to be a focus on safety and soundness of banks is now a focus on financial stability. So the common way of describing the safety and soundness role of regulation is that banks are subject to runs. With banks being subject to runs, that will create knock-on effects which will upset contagion to other banks, further runs, because if you got money in a bank, you probably don't even have the ability to figure out if the bank is sound. There is the multiple equilibrium problem, so even if it is sound, if other people aren't checking and are starting a run, it would be good to run. And thirdly, there is the speed element. Yes, maybe you could figure it out, but you don't want to wait because by then it may be too late. And after a run, the people who get their money out early get all their money out. The people who come later have two problems. One problem is even if they get it all, it's often tied up for a while, so there's a liquidity problem. And the other is that they do generally lose some money. On average, there isn't a whole lot of loss, but there's a distribution of losses which anybody actually document. So that's why when the FDIC closes a small bank, it does it on a Friday afternoon, and the bank reopens on Monday with a new name, because they arrange some bank to buy at a negative price the bank, or they take away the bad part and they get a deposit on what's left. And the idea is to keep the payment system flowing, keep the wealth preserved, avoid any possibility of contagion, in part because people will often not even know that the bank was closed. It just wasn't a bank run. But if you're providing insurance, you have a moral hazard problem. So if you have fire insurance for something expensive, you'll have requirements in the contract for having fire extinguishers around and smoke detectors, and you'll do some monitoring. So a natural thing is to make sure banks are not too risky relative to the costs on the deposit insurers. And so that's where microprudential regulation is about. It's taking snapshots of a bank to see whether it is sound, so that if there's a threat of a run, it can be taken over at little or no cost. And so it's a picture today because as long as we keep doing these pictures often enough, all you're planning to do is step in, and all you have to do is have it above insolvency at the moment that you step in. The focus then is primarily on insured institutions. So money market funds, which behave a lot like banks taking checking deposits, did not have this kind of insurance, did not have this kind of regulation until the runs on money market funds started after Lehman, and the government stepped in with insurance as the simple, quick way of stopping all of the runs. Money market funds are a lot smaller than they used to be, but they're still a very large part of the U.S. financial picture. So what does it mean to switch over from safety and soundness of banks to financial stability? First of all, it means you're going to worry about any financial institutions that might jeopardize the stability of the financial system, whether they're taking short deposits or not. Secondly, you're going to recognize, as we do now, that you can have bank runs in what's called the shadow banking system. And the bank runs come not so much from depositors in the usual sense, but very short-term lenders. And there's a great deal of overnight lending that happens here. So a bank run is very easy. You just don't lend again the next day. And so again, there's a risk that's much wider than there was before. And the new vocabulary is macroprudential regulation, which is looking in principle at all of financial stability. So far, the regulatory process hasn't gotten there. What happened is, to replace the snapshot from before, the stress tests that happened in the US and Europe are really videos. So the banks are given a scenario. What if we go into a recession that's so big? And in this recession, this is happening and that is happening in some of these markets. Now calculate through whether at some time through this scenario you run afoul of the solvency conditions or the minimum requirements of capital. And if the video shows too much of a risk of your running out in this bad scenario, then you're forced to raise more capital. The US stress test was very successful in the way it went, in that a number of banks went out and raised more capital. They were able to do it without too much trouble because the Fed was basically saying, if they have this capital, we don't see any problems. And secondly, the rest of the financial system were getting a good bill of health. The European one didn't work as well because it lacked credibility. I mean, the idea that you're seeing if European banks are sound without allowing any calculation of the possibility of Greek debt losing value, it seems to me to be, it's like doing Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. You're leaving out the main character we're all thinking about. So it was not successful in calming the market. Real macroprudential regulation doesn't yet exist because a great deal of the interaction we talk about comes from a couple of forms. One of them is if a bank needs to rapidly raise liquidity, it's going to be selling off assets. That, particularly if it has to do it very quickly, could drive down prices. Given mark to market, that could create a set of other financial institutions that are now having trouble. And so what we need really is a video of the economy and the role of the individual banks in it. And we're not yet in terms of the regulatory development and sophistication at that point. So naturally, the regulatory institutions need a framework. They need a framework to figure out what it is they're doing. They need a framework to communicate with the general public and with the regulated firms who will be pushing back, and the question is, what's the nature of that dialogue? So Eric Rosengren is the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, where, full disclosure, I'm a part-time visiting scholar. After the Fed disappeared, given my ongoing interest in this and the need to learn nitty-gritty details, that seemed like an attractive way of doing it. And he put forward in a speech, as you see, I'm relatively up to date. It's not a very old speech. And it also gives a sense in which this process of the challenge for the regulators is time-consuming to figure out and going forward. So what is financial stability? It's getting the financial system to do what the economy relies on. And two things: payment systems. We don't think much of that because so much of that is insured, and so by and large payment system is not a worry. And secondly, credit intermediation. Credit intermediation happens in multiple ways. There's the intermediation that happens when a bank does lots of loans and does it with money from the depositors. This is the kind of thing that Douglas Diamond, who is not only not me, but also not a relative, has modeled, along with then the problem of how do you pay attention to the banks and their incentives. You have a governance issue given this structure. And credit intermediation happens to a considerable extent on timing mismatches. Somebody wants to borrow long, somebody wants to lend short. Will somebody do the gap? Well, there's a profit to be made in the gap. In fact, that's how reserve banking works. And the question is, what is the role of that in helping the economy, and what are the difficulties that come with that? The obvious difficulty is it lends itself to bank runs. Financial instability is something that is disruptive. And that's interesting because it takes us back, actually, to the creation of the Fed. In the 19th century, we didn't have a central bank. And in the course of the year, because of the varying demands for credit and supplies of credit, particularly connected to the agriculture cycle, the nominal interest rate would vary a great deal in the course of the year. There would be a very marked seasonal factor in that nominal interest rate, just as there are sharp seasonal factors in many other things. The book by Jeff Myron on seasonal patterns and how they correlate in some ways with cyclic patterns is a very interesting thing to think about what makes the concern for one of them and what makes the concern for the other so different. We don't worry about the fact that an awful lot of retail sales happen in the run-up to Christmas. But we do worry about the fact that an awful lot of retail sales happen in booms and go way down in recessions. So what's going on here? Why do we want to think that way? A very interesting set of questions on which Jeff made a small start, a nice model, but there were lots of interesting questions there. So what's the problem with the fluctuations in interest rates? Well, the answer is when credit was tight, which would be marked by the rise of the interest rates, the bank runs on the then uninsured banks were much more likely to happen. Statistically, financial crises in the US in the 19th century were more likely to start at a time when the credit was tight and the interest rates were high. So one of the jobs of the Fed at the creation was to have an elastic currency, to have variation in the provision of liquidity so that the interest rate got stabilized over the year. And the kinds of runs we had before don't happen. And that's been a success, although there are a whole bunch of issues of what the novice Fed did wrong that contributed to the magnitude of Great Depression, which that by itself doesn't tell you anything. You've got to look at the counterfactual. The counterfactual is, with the Fed there, some of the previous institutions changed. And so it's really a comparison there. But if you say, you start a central bank, you got to think it's going to be a learning process. Maybe it's worthwhile anyway. But then I wasn't born until the Great Depression was about to end. So that's financial stability and instability. So that's our starting place. Now, how do we want to think about that? Well, here's a quote from a debate in The Economist between Luigi Zingales and Brad DeLong over Keynesian things. And it's here because it makes a critical point that economists very widely agree with, which is there is a need to have an underlying theory of why something is a problem as a justification for the kinds of interventions that are being called for here. And so Luigi talked about, we have a problem from housing, we should have policies about housing, and he had a proposal. We have a problem with banks, we should have policies aimed at banks, and he had a proposal. And down a list like that. And Brad agreed with the value of doing all the things he identified, but said, but of course, this combination has given us very high unemployment. And if we can do something to hold down unemployment while waiting for fixing all the other things, why on earth wouldn't we do it? And that's the Keynesian piece coming in. So there is, in my limited contacts with central bankers, a clear picture of a need to have a vocabulary that economists are comfortable with, as part not just of the interaction between central banks and academic researchers, but also part of the public response to what the central banks are doing. If the profession, by and large, is saying they don't know what they're doing, the political process is going to be a lot more scrutinizing of the central banks than if, yes, there's a clear picture of the kind of need, yes, this is the kind of thing to do, that parameter is wrong, or this parameter is wrong, but the frame is there. So here is a statement by Dan Tarullo, one of the governors of the Federal Reserve System, and the one who's really been put in charge. Governors have many duties, and so different people are point men for addressing different things. And the critical words to pick up here are negative externalities. Because every economist knows if you have an externality, you don't have Pareto optimality. Actually, that's not quite right. It's got to be an externality at the margin. So if you pollute something and then everybody goes away and nobody's affected, you can pollute a little bit more without making anything worse, and maybe that would be better than having no pollution at all. The example I've used when I taught intermediate micro theory is you have two lakes. You can't run industry without polluting. The right thing to do is pollute one of them and leave one of them clean for the swimmers. And if you do that, it may turn out that at the margin, a little more pollution doesn't matter. So this is actually a point made by James Buchanan many years ago. But let's forget that, because the kinds of externalities we're familiar with and most concerned about, pollution and congestion, there are margins. The air gets a little dirtier, it bothers you. The climate gets a little hotter, I believe it bothers you. The road gets a little more congested. Well, there comes a point when you're not moving at all, but sooner or later you start moving again, and the amount of congestion matters. So let's just stick with externalities in that vocabulary. So let's find an externality and find a way to correct it. And I saw exactly the same vocabulary used when I went to Basel for a BIS meeting. So let's take a look at how public finance people approach externalities. The classic way is if you have an externality, a technological externality, where somebody's action affects somebody's utility directly, or somebody's action affects the production function of some firm directly, then the equilibrium is not Pareto optimal, and putting in place a Pigouvian tax on any activity that generates an externality, which is precisely equal to the value of that externality. I'm putting this in not in marginal rate of substitution terms, but everything's measured relative to a numeraire and et cetera. Then you get back first best. Alternatively, you could look at the outcome that would come from that, and there are a set of regulations that would match it, but we normally think of them as complicated. So the Pigouvian tax is the answer. And notice, in designing the correct level of a Pigouvian tax, there are no trade-offs. You're hitting people with exactly the right prices, so they're doing exactly the right thing for overall efficiency, and there are no problems. What happens when you're in a second-best world? A second-best world, there are a bunch of examples out there. One is you can only use a simple tax when you need a complex tax. So if you're talking about air pollution, it may matter exactly where the pollution is happening. It may be happening upwind or downwind from lots of population. So if you're setting Pigouvian taxes, you need to set them differently for different sources. And probably you'd have to also, of course, address all the different pollutants, because different pollutants have different marginal externalities. So you would, in fact, have to have such an extraordinarily complex tax system that, first of all, it exceeds our ability to do it. Secondly, it exceeds our ability to figure out what it should be. Secondly, we often can't measure and so tax the source of the externality. So we'll tax related behavior or regulate related behavior. So it would be prohibitively expensive to put a meter on every tailpipe of every car and also record where the pollution is happening, since it varies locally. And instead, so what we do is, on one hand, we can require cars to be less polluting. That's a regulatory approach. And secondly, we could discourage driving, because driving is correlated with polluting and conditional on the cars that we've regulated. And so we could be taxing some related behavior. Maybe we'll tax output because we're not measuring what's actually coming out of the smokestack. As soon as the tax isn't exactly right, as soon as the tax is on something wrong, then we face a trade-off. We are distorting some aspect of behavior. So if you tax output rather than the pollution, you're getting wrong the incentives on how to trade off between more output and more investment in holding down the pollution. And so whenever you have an imperfect correction, you're interfering with something else. And so you've got a trade-off between a reduction in externality and an imperfect correction. And that really is the mindset I've seen in the central bankers, that the externality is, boy, if they cause another banking crisis and we have another depression, that's a big negative externality. And the problem is a belief, and I'll get back to that, that regulating capital requirements, which is the prime thing being talked about, will hurt in the normal time functioning of credit intermediation, which is an issue I'll get back to. The other element I think that's important to keep in mind is the contrast between complete markets and incomplete markets. So complete markets start with the complete list of the states of nature. Obviously impossible. And even if it were possible, the cost of doing it would be prohibitive. Duncan Foley and Frank Hahn have talked about how if there's even a small cost to figuring out what you're going to do in the distant future for a low probability state, it's not worth doing. So you won't get all the trade done at once as complete markets happen. Incomplete markets have surprises, and the world is full of surprises. And it's not just markets. Obviously, we have the same kind of issue behind incomplete contracts. With complete markets, you have a market price for each good in each state of nature over all the rest of time. With incomplete markets, we've got prices for today's goods and today's assets, but there may be some futures contracts out there, but by and large, you don't have future prices. You have expectations of future prices. That's a critical part relating to Arrow's very famous article where he says, oh, you don't need all the markets, you need a market in numeraire for each state of nature, and then when you get to whichever one happened, you can trade for the actual goods. And he shows you could get exactly the same allocation as with complete markets. 64 paper in the Review of Economic Studies, really a republication of something earlier. And the problem is, to prove that theorem, everybody has to know what the future prices are. But the whole point of markets is to tell you about prices. So how do you figure out what all those prices are without it? With complete markets, everyone has a single budget constraint. And if everybody satisfies their budget constraint as we model them, there is no bankruptcy in the sense of a state of nature where you don't deliver what you promised. With incomplete markets, you have multiple budget constraints that you write down. You know, you're on this track, here's what you'll be able to do. You're on that track, then later that's what you'll be able to do. And we allow bankruptcy, which is a good thing, because if everybody in an incomplete market world behaved the same way people behave in a complete market world, nobody could borrow money if there was any probability of their being unable to pay it back. And that would basically destroy the industrial structure. Maybe you could do that on services, but you sure can't do it on goods. And it's clear allowing bankruptcy is a vital part of having a functioning incomplete market economy. So plans do involve bankruptcy, and that's an important part of it. So what about externalities? In complete markets, the only externalities are technological externalities. I drive my car, you inhale too close to my tailpipe, I've affected you. If I decide to give more lectures, and as a result your lecture fee goes down, that's a pecuniary externality and is not part of the cause of a deviation from Pareto optimality. What happens with incomplete markets, that's no longer the case. And while the complete market fundamental welfare theorem is that if you don't have any externalities and you have the other usual rules, you have Pareto optimality, the incomplete market fundamental welfare theorem, due to Giannakopoulos and Polymarchakis, is generically you always have Pareto non-optimality relative to things the government can do without even violating the limits that are shown in the markets, just by doing ex-ante redistributions that change prices, because changes of prices change people's opportunities. So the point I'm making here is it's not so simple to go from that attractive vocabulary, oh, let's look at the negative externalities, and let's look at how we might be interfering with the capital market, into what is the right number. Everybody agrees, except the banks themselves and some Republicans, that capital requirements should be raised. There is wide disagreement over how much. And what we are lacking, to my mind, is a firm underpinning for getting at how much. So here's a rule that came out of a Basel International Committee looking at things to do, and the answer that came out with is the expected impact of a failure of a SIB should be the same as the expected impact of the failure of a non-SIB. Now, a small local bank goes bust, it may cost the deposit insurers some money, small potatoes, and maybe it has some interaction of contagion, but probably not. And what happens with a big bank? Well, we'll see big banks get in trouble. They pull down all sorts of things with them. So we can say, what's the high cost associated with that? And how do we drive that probability down? I find, first of all, central banks have a problem, a real-time problem, which is they've got to get on with making policy. This is the moment to be changing the rules, even though we'll be learning more in the future. You have to do it now. And they can't wait. They can change the rules further when they learn more. And so they need a vocabulary to talk about it. They need something that you can then do measurement around the different pieces, and you roll out some numbers. And then people can start tinkering with the numbers, tinkering with the rules. And so this is a start. I don't have anything negative to say about this is a place to start. But what I do want to say is this is not a place to finish for several reasons. First of all, it is not a property of optimal second best trade-offs that you have a condition like this. There's a cost of doing things. There's a benefit of doing things. You want to push things to the margin. You don't get, oh, the expected cost is the same, this use and that use, unless you have certain properties of the trade-off elements that are there. So it's not grounded as a principle. Secondly, it's focused on failure. Yet, as we saw in the banking crisis, the strengths of banks was of great importance even when we aren't talking failure. That is, the way to quickly move and keep things going is to get some banks to take over other banks or take over parts of other banks to keep the services flowing. And the ability to do that depends on the strengths of the banks, so it's not just a failure issue. There's a whole distribution of how strong or weak they are, and there are externalities associated with different pieces. Let me, in the few minutes left, talk about an interesting literature from the perspective of this. In the Clarendon lectures, if I'm allowed to mention a lecture series at some other place, Shin, it's a wonderful lecture, lays out a picture pointing out that the big financial institutions use value at risk in determining how much risk they want to take on. And an extreme example of that was zero probability of bankruptcy. And he says, what happens when you have mark-to-market and you have this kind of circumstance? What happens is when the banks are strong, have a lot of wealth, and he models them basically as a risk-neutral player up to bankruptcy, which is avoided, then the risk premium is small because a lot of the risk in the economy has been taken over by the risk-neutral player. The other players are then facing less aggregate risk, and facing less aggregate risk, there's a lower risk premium, so investment is easier to do. On the other hand, when the banks get weak, then they're going to take on less risk, there's more risk on other agents, risk premium goes up, and he argues this is part of the kind of cycle we get, where in good times we have a low risk premium, in bad times we have a high risk premium, and this pattern is the source of some of our macro problems. The point here I want to make is if you're looking at a complete market structure and you're looking at different economies that differ in the relative wealths of the risk-neutral agent and the risk-averse agent, then the risk premiums will be different across those economies. But being a complete market equilibrium, it will be Pareto optimal. You can't say that that cross-section fluctuation is a problem unless you identify a reason for the problem. Incomplete markets are a reason, and while the concrete example Shin gives is actually a cross-section one, the dialogue is about the dynamics. Well, dynamics within complete markets, recognizing that in some sense wealth will be varying over time, still doesn't interfere with Pareto optimality. But if you have incomplete markets, you have, for example, repeated one-period market structures, then depending on how risk in one period was shared, the next period the premium will swing. And presumably, I say presumably because nobody has written down a model and done evaluation, that's not going to be optimal. And if we can decrease the swings in the relative wealths of the two sides by regulatory rules or other interventions, presumably it will go better. The other example that's out there, John Giannakopoulos, a series of papers with a number of different co-authors, catchy title, Leverage Cycle, same observation. This is typo. The Shin model is based on different wealths of agents with different risks. Oh, that's part. No typo. In Shin, it's different risk aversions of different people. In Giannakopoulos, there are optimists and pessimists, and people have subjective probabilities. And what happens if the optimists have more wealth and the pessimists less, or vice versa? Well, again, the risk premium changes. So it tells the same kind of story as Shin, but again, if you have complete markets, it's Pareto optimal. Pareto optimal, evaluating things for people using their own subjective probabilities. And what happens if it's incomplete? Well, same kind of story. Probably there's room to do better, but again, no theorems. I'm troubled by the use, as standard Arrow-Debreu theory does, of people's own subjective probabilities for normative outcomes. It seems to me, insofar as you can get somewhere where we're talking about these financial things, you might want to think about a suggestion that Carl Christian von Weizsäcker put forward many years ago. You might want to think about evaluating expected utilities using the true probabilities and asking, are there policies that come from that when you recognize that the government does not know the true probabilities either? And the answer that comes out of that is, if there's gambling going on that doesn't represent a hedge for anybody. I think horse A will win the race, you think horse B will win the race. Whichever horse wins is not correlated with any of the other risks we're facing. Then if we bet on them, what we've done relative to the true probabilities is add noise to our utility outcomes, which is going to lower the sum of expected utilities because of risk aversion. I think that insight should be the starting place for addressing the issue of derivative regulation. What kinds of derivatives you allow, what kind of derivatives you either don't allow or you don't allow certain agents to engage in. I've actually run out of time. A whole lot of credit intermediation issues. Actually, I haven't run out of time. You can read the list. I don't have anything to say about most of them, except the derivative statement. And let me just be very clear. I believe derivatives do play an important role in the efficient functioning of the economy. The ability of a firm to get rid of the risk that isn't their focus seems to me to matter. So I don't share the view that Paul Volcker has expressed, that the most important innovation of the last 20 years is the cash machine. And on a trip, I passed through Asheville, North Carolina, where there was this freestanding cash machine that looked so much like a Greek temple that I thought it belonged here. Let me just run very quickly through two more points. One, Sheila Bair was the head of the FDIC. She was repeatedly on the right side of the, with hindsight, the fights with the other regulators. And she did an exit interview after she stepped down. And, oh no, this was a statement. Regulators, she did do an exit interview that makes good reading if you Google and find it. But this, I think, is something that really calls for a lot of thought. Because is it the case that a lot of the debt financing, say, of hedge funds, comes from the fact that the lenders are undervaluing the risk that the hedge funds fully understand? A further version of this is a recent paper by Andre Schleifer and co-author I've forgotten, saying, in fact, it is in the incentive There's an incentive for financial institutions creating complex institutions to look for things which the potential buyers will put a low probability on, or extremely, a zero probability on, and then produce something that you know is more valuable than they think it is, and you sell it to them. So I think this is a real issue that needs a lot of attention. It relates perhaps in part to the Giannakopoulos optimist-pessimist, the recognition that there's huge diversity in evaluations of what's going to happen in the economy out there. That's Marshall again. Good times and bad times call for rethinking policies that affect both of them. And there is a list, and I'm only 5 minutes late. That doesn't count. Time for Q&A.